great to host this, and I'm really appreciative of Chairman Clayton and the other colleagues from the SEC who've been able to join us today for a really engaging discussion. We'll get to the substance in a moment. I would say, just as Dean, it's been an amazing pleasure to see the way that both in our classes and in our kind of extracurricular top flight centers like the Institute for Law and Economics, or ILE, we've been able to continue to connect and explore great topics, even through this COVID era when we're not physically together. For those of you, and I know there's Penn Law alumni on the call, as well as some students watching, we're one of the few schools at Penn that is open in kind of a hybrid model, where there are a number of students, particularly first years, on campus the past few weeks, going well, but a lot of our content is being delivered and sent all over the world to other students who are learning virtually through remote classes. Our two tremendous ILE co-directors, Professors Fish and Elizabeth Pullman, kind of embody that dichotomy. Professor Fish, I've seen on campus, although we've both been wearing masks, and is teaching corporations on campus, as well as another area of expertise some of you may not have known she had as a civil procedure teacher, and I'm really appreciative of her being in there in the classroom with our 1Ls. Conversely, Professor Pullman also, I appreciate, we're really global, we're worldwide. So she's teaching a corporations class to about 90 people, starting at, I think, 9:00 p.m. Eastern time at night, so that we can allow students in Asia as well as in Philadelphia to take it and not be in the middle of the night. So that's kind of the new world at the law school, but we're continuing to do well. And one thing that for many decades has done really well here is the kind of innovative cross-disciplinary work that ILE does to bring together government leaders, faculty from Wharton and the economics department and other parts of the university, practitioners from multiple cities around the U.S. And we're all here on this call. And I really appreciate the work of ILE's leadership. And I want to hand it off to ILE's, one of ILE's leaders as academic co-director, Professor Jill Fish, who will more appropriately introduce the program. And Chairman Clayton, Jill's going to introduce you, but I just want to speak for all of us when I really appreciate your joining us and sharing your wisdom about what must be an incredibly changing and difficult regulatory environment with all of the issues that existed pre-COVID, as well as the kind of COVID era. So thank you so much for being with us. Jill?
Thanks, Ted. And let me add my welcome to Ted's. Good afternoon to everyone who is watching this. Welcome to our distinguished panelists. And of course, on behalf of my co-director, Elizabeth Pullman, Executive Director Larry Hammermesh, Penn Law, and the Institute of Law and Economics, it gives me great pleasure to welcome back Walter Jay Clayton. As many of you know, Jay's no stranger to Penn. Just last year, he delivered ILE's Distinguished Jurist Lecture. My goodness, that seems like a long time ago. Before leaving Sullivan and Cromwell to serve as chairman of the SEC, Jay taught a M&A course here at Penn for 8 years with his partner, Joe Frumkin. And just a few short years before that, Jay graduated summa cum laude from Penn School of Engineering and then cum laude from the law school. But enough about Penn, let's talk about Jay. As I mentioned, Jay was a partner at Sullivan and Cromwell, where he spent more than 20 years. He left the S&C and was sworn in as chairman on May 4th, 2017. And as Ted said, it's been a really challenging time to be the top cop on Wall Street. The SEC has been incredibly busy in recent months, dealing with everything from the effects of the global lockdown on issuers' ability to meet their periodic reporting deadlines, to the market turmoil associated with the economic impact of the pandemic. As Jay told a congressional subcommittee in June, we experienced the 10 highest days of equity trading volume of all time in 2020. On March 16th, 2020, the VIX index, which provides an options-based market measure of expected future volatility, reached an all-time high. Indeed, it's pretty amazing that Jay and Stephanie have the time to talk to us today, given the media reports of all of the alleged misconduct in connection with that market turmoil. Penn Law, too, has been facing its challenges. As Ted said, we're working to create a hybrid teaching environment that both responds to the public health risks associated with the pandemic while retaining a vibrant academic experience for our students, faculty, alumni, and friends. Whether we like it or not, we're forced to innovate with newly structured virtual program to supplement a very limited in-person environment. It's a huge help during that effort to have somebody like Jay to support us by kicking off our fall programming. It's my great honor to welcome Jay back, albeit virtually, to Penn Law. Jay?
Well, thank you, Jill, and welcome to all to this discussion of how we, and Stephanie Avakian is here with me, how we manage, measure, and oversee the performance of our enforcement division. And I'm going to begin with some acknowledgments as well. First, Jill, a big thank you to you and to Ted for your kind introduction, and I caught some of your testimony earlier today. Nice job. Turning to the Penn community more broadly, a thank you to the Institute for Law and Economics for being our host. I view your programming as second to none in the way it synthesizes the analysis of laws, markets, and importantly, outcomes. The ILE is just one of many fine examples of what I think is Penn's greatest strength, pursuing rigorous academic study, always with an eye towards societal impact and improvement. I think that's just as Penn's founder, Ben Franklin, would have wanted it. Second, a thank you to our 4 panelists and a specific shout out to Steve Cutler, who I first met 15 or so years ago when he was the SEC's Director of Enforcement. When I agreed to take on the role of SEC Chairman, the question of how best to oversee the Enforcement Division became front of mind. While I was fortunate to have more litigation and investigative experience than you would expect from a corporate attorney, I had not managed an enforcement program of any size, much yet one of over 1,400 professionals distributed across 12 offices. Steve set me straight. Speaking my language, he noted that the Enforcement Division was an established, well-functioning subsidiary with products, in other words, cases, that had long production cycles, and assets, in other words, people, that were fixed and valuable. In other words, attorneys who enjoyed their job, knew each other well, and were committed to the mission. And third, a thank you to Stephanie Avakian, who you will hear from in a few minutes. Stephanie is the top cop on Wall Street. Stephanie was the acting director of enforcement when I arrived, and I had not previously met her. Many people, including the other Steve on today's panel, Steve Peikin, expressed interest in the director position. Well, to make a long story short, it was quickly apparent to me that Steve Cutler's description of the division was correct. And importantly, that well-functioning subsidiary already had an effective and well-respected leader in Stephanie. And here I'll share an anecdote. A friend who knew Stephanie professionally said to me, "Do not interview her if you do not want to hire her." That was unassailably correct advice, but as a practical matter, unnecessary, because in reality, it was the other way around. Stephanie was actually interviewing me on behalf of herself and the career staff of the division. And Stephanie, I thank you and your colleagues for hiring me. With that context, I'll provide some reflections on our oversight, management, and the performance of the Enforcement Division. And I want to highlight a few examples where the work of the division has yielded significant long-term benefits for U.S. investors, including shaping our regulatory agenda and informing our rulemaking. In managing an organization, there are some fundamental questions. Two of the most important to me are, one, what are we trying to accomplish? And two, how are we going to measure our performance? Starting with the second question, while the Enforcement Division's traditional statistics were and continue to be impressive, it's my view that we should take care not to manage to available data. Or said another way, as in any endeavor, we should guard against allowing the data that is readily available to drive objectives rather than measures that reflect our core principles. Ultimately, objectives and related metrics should be grounded in an organization's foundational principles. So where to start when defining principles? We, Stephanie, Steve, and I started by asking, how would a long-term retail investor want us to allocate our resources? With that lens, we settled on, one, getting harmed retail investors their money back as promptly as practicable. 2, pursuing matters that will have a lasting positive impact for investors broadly. In other words, deterring or eliminating widespread inappropriate practices. And 3, instilling confidence in the integrity and fairness of our markets. And doing so in each case with an eye toward our 50 million household-strong retail investor base. I'm pleased to say, through the leadership of Stephanie, Steve Peikin, and their many colleagues, these principles have shaped the division's objectives and its performance for the benefit of investors. Another fundamental managerial question for organizations is method of execution. Here, I'll start by returning to the observation that in the Enforcement Division is a people-driven organization, akin to a high-end professional services business. In my experience, well-functioning professional services organizations have both talented, experienced, and diverse personnel with strong character, as well as a commitment to each other and to a shared mission. And 2, they have an environment where those professionals have a combination of guidance, freedom, and support, which enables them to take action and maximize their effectiveness. Our frontline enforcement personnel, by necessity, make tens of thousands of judgments each year. They need to know that those judgments will be supported, and if they reach out for advice, that it will be freely given and mission-oriented. I committed to Stephanie and Steve that I would defer to and support them on how best to promote that type of culture. And they succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation I could have had. Turning to some specifics in the area of execution, I will note just a few of the Enforcement Division's initiatives and how their work has led to real, lasting impact for our Main Street investors. First, I'll highlight the work of the Retail Strategy Task Force, including our Teachers and Veterans initiatives and our Share Class Selection Disclosure initiative. One of the questions I always encourage Main Street investors to ask is, how much of my money is going to work for me? And how much is being used to pay fees and expenses? Just think for a moment about the cost to a single investor of paying an extra 150 basis points in fees over 25 years on $100,000 invested in a retirement account. By one reporter's account, some back-of-the-envelope math gives a difference of over $100,000 in lost gains over that time period, and that's for a single investor. Time and again, our teams in our Office of Compliance and Inspections and Examinations and our Enforcement Division have worked hard to save investors from paying fees that they did not know about and should not have been charged. For example, our Share Class Disclosure Initiative alone will result in nearly $139 million going back to investors, and it can be expected to save investors that amount many times over in the years to come. Second, I'm proud of our work in the area of ICOs. To call the ICO activity of late 2016 and 2017 a mess would be kind. I look back on that time as a stark present-day reminder that the behavior identified by the Pecora Commission in the early 1930s, in other words, a combination of fraud, speculation, and widespread harm that drove the enactment of the Securities Act and the Exchange Act, can easily return in the absence of a culture of compliance and regulatory vigilance. One study estimated that as of mid-2018, 86% of the prior year's leading ICOs were trading below their offering price, with nearly a third of those ICOs having lost virtually all their value. Apparently at that time, and I'm thinking back to 2017 and 2018, intoxicated or distracted by an admittedly powerful technology, many market participants, both investors and much more concerning to me, certain market professionals, accepted form over substance and pursued profit over responsibility. The Commission and the Enforcement Division responded quickly. Through a series of measures and timely actions, the Enforcement Division restored order while leaving room for distributed ledger technology and other technologies to drive cost savings and innovation in the future. This would not have been possible but for a culture that supports proactive decision-making and encourages principles-based flexibility, or as I like to say, being nimble. Third, and more recently, the division again demonstrated its nimble nature in response to the effects of COVID-19. Our various divisions and offices took an array of prompt investor and market function-oriented actions, and the Enforcement Division was no exception. The division's action including trading suspensions for almost 36 companies. In a number of these circumstances, the division followed with enforcement actions against issuers and individuals allegedly engaged in fraud based on COVID-19 related claims, such as preferred access to caches of personal protective equipment and the development of effective COVID-19 tests. Stephanie and Steve also released a statement early on reminding market participants of the importance of maintaining market integrity and following corporate controls and procedures, especially during such times. This proved prescient. Good corporate hygiene cannot be overstated, nor can the importance of related controls designed to prevent not only insider trading, but also the appearance of impropriety or misalignment of interests. Just this week, I sent Subcommittee Chairman Brad Sherman and Ranking Member Bill Huizenga of the House Financial Services Committee a letter at Chairman Sherman's request, in which I discussed some specific measures that public companies and their insiders should consider to promote compliance, market integrity, and investor confidence, including through a demonstrated commitment to good corporate governance. As I mentioned at the outset, the impact of the work in these areas and many other initiatives is not readily apparent in traditional metrics, such as number of actions or monetary relief. That's one reason in the area of metrics, particularly with related to enforcement, I am generally most interested in the combination of 1, money returned to investors, in other words, harm remedied, and 2, money saved by investors, in other words, harm prevented. A final point on the Enforcement Division's initiatives. We require our registrants to disclose both good and bad news. And in that vein, it is appropriate for me to note that not every initiative has been as successful as I would like. Early in my tenure, I took up the personal initiative of focusing on the victims of the R. Allen Stanford fraud. These Main Street investors were defrauded brazenly in circumstances where there were multiple indicia of regulatory and investor protection. Yet over a decade later, recoveries have been virtually non-existent and lawsuits drag on. I recognize that recoveries have been slowed by the international nature of the fraud. As I have often said, once money leaves our jurisdiction, it is very, very hard for us to get it back. They've also been hampered by the complexity of the claims process and other legal proceedings. But by any measure, it's been way too little and way too long. It is my sincere hope that we both continue to work on behalf of these victims to return as much of their defrauded money as possible, and more generally, we evaluate our oversight, inspection, and recovery efforts to bolster our ability to combat wrongdoing and act quickly in the future. The last execution-related matter I will discuss involves the integration of our enforcement program into the work of our policy divisions and offices. Our markets are ever-changing, and the financial markets of today are substantially different from those of the early 2000s. This dynamic requires us to retrospectively review and update the implementation of our regulatory framework. Our policy divisions and offices have been extremely busy in this regard. During my tenure as chairman, these divisions and offices have advanced over 100 proposed and final rules, and enforcement has been involved in and greatly improved many of the key investor protection initiatives. For example, with the interests of Main Street investors front of mind, we adopted Regulation Best Interest and Form CRS, which established a new heightened standard of conduct for broker-dealers when dealing with retail customers, and an investor-oriented uniform disclosure form for broker-dealers and investment advisors. The views and experience of enforcement played an important role in these groundbreaking developments. In the over-the-counter or OTC market, where the majority of enforcement cases have involved delinquent filings, yesterday the Commission adopted amendments to Rule 15c211 to facilitate more current information from OTC issuers and to better protect investors from fraudulent and manipulative schemes using OTC issuers and stale information. Again, benefiting from substantial input from the Enforcement Division. Soon we will take up amendments to our whistleblower rules designed to make the program more effective and efficient. This program has already benefited greatly from the guidance of Stephanie and her colleagues in the Enforcement Division. You've made it much more efficient and effective. And I expect our rules will benefit from that insight going forward. I'll be closing now and noting that human nature being what it is, there is still, as there always will be, work to be done in the area of enforcement. When I turn over leadership of the Commission, my goal for the Enforcement Division is that it continues to bring meaningful cases that have a substantial impact on investors and the integrity of our markets. I'm very grateful to my predecessor, Chair Mary Jo White, for providing us with that strong, well-functioning, and professional subsidiary that I referenced at the outset. Stephanie and Steve built on this foundation, and the achievements of the Enforcement Division have been impactful and long-lasting because of their exemplary leadership. Only leaders with such skill, experience, and steadfast dedication to their staff, with the added bonus of competitive drive and commitment to continued improvement, could have achieved such impressive and meaningful results for investors, particularly in the face of new judicial limitations on our authority, a government shutdown, and a pandemic. I'm not going to dwell on those challenges other than to return to the issue of metrics and note that one of the most reliable measures of performance is how did you handle yourself and how did you perform in the face of adversity? On this metric, Stephanie and Steve and the Enforcement Division scored a 12 on a scale of 1 to 10. I will close with some advice that I hope has similar value to the advice I received almost 4 years ago from Steve Cutler. If and when Stephanie departs, I encourage my successor to seek out a director who will lead, as Stephanie and Steve did for us, by example and through that powerful combination of deference, cooperation, and support. And with that, I'll turn it over to our Director of Enforcement, Stephanie Avakian.
Thanks, Jay. I almost don't want to say anything now.
Well, Stephanie, if, I'm sorry, but before we turn it over to you, there are just two housekeeping matters that I want to flag. First of all, we're required, in accordance with the CLE requirements, to identify a secret code word, and the secret code word for the first half hour of the program is Cutler. Just, something that everybody can keep in their minds. And the second thing, I want to make sure the viewing audience knows that after your remarks, that you and Jay will be available to take questions. And so that we get those questions lined up, we encourage you to use the live chat on the YouTube feed. And both Stephanie and Jay will be around afterwards to respond to those questions. So I'm sorry to interrupt. Thanks, Stephanie, and welcome.
Thanks very much. So good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to speak today, and thank you, Jay, for your very kind remarks. Before I begin, I'm required to tell you that the views I express here today are my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Commission or the Commission staff. And so with that, here we are in mid-September, just 2 weeks from the end of our fiscal year. This is always a busy time for us in enforcement, and it's also a time when we start to reflect on our efforts over the prior year. And so today, I'm going to look a little more broadly at the work of the Division of Enforcement since May 2017, when Chairman Clayton joined the agency and appointed Steve Peikin and me as co-directors of enforcement. When he took the job, Chairman Clayton outlined his priorities for the enforcement program, as you heard him say. Broadly speaking, to aggressively protect the everyday retail investor and preserve the integrity of our markets. And while he has most certainly been our strongest supporter, he left the overall direction and management of the program to us. And so what did we do? Well, Steve and I approached the job guided by a single overarching principle. The vigorous enforcement of the federal securities laws is crucial to combat wrongdoing, to compensate harmed investors, and to maintain confidence in the integrity and the fairness of our markets. The overall direction of the enforcement program and the everyday decisions on individual cases reflect our adherence to that principle throughout our tenure. We had two main goals, which are two of the three areas I will cover today. First, investigating and recommending to the Commission impactful cases in areas of importance to the protection of investors that took into account and addressed new developments in the securities industry and markets. And second, identifying and making strategic changes in how we operate so that we could achieve those results more efficiently and effectively. And finally, although we didn't realize it at the time, it turned out we would have to try to achieve those goals in the face of substantial, unexpected challenges. And those challenges are the third area I will discuss today. Notwithstanding those challenges, through the mutual support and dedication of more than 1,400 professionals in the division and the complementary efforts of our colleagues across the Commission, we succeeded in achieving our goals. So from a macro perspective, so far, during Chairman Clayton's tenure, the Commission has brought more than 2,550 enforcement actions, obtained $14 billion in financial remedies, distributed more than $3.3 billion to harmed investors, and paid awards of more than $350 million to whistleblowers. We continue to bring the types of cases that the Commission has historically brought against large public companies and financial institutions. This includes cases against Facebook, Tesla, Theranos, Valeant, Volkswagen, Fiat Chrysler, and Mylan, to name a few, as well as cases against many of the world's largest financial institutions, including Wells Fargo, Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase, Barclays, and Merrill Lynch. The Commission has similarly continued to obtain substantial financial remedies in its enforcement actions. In fiscal year 2019 alone, the Commission obtained financial remedies of $4.3 billion. That is the highest amount the Commission has ever obtained in a single year, or at least since 2002, which is as far back as we reliably track this metric. What's more, I can tell you today that we are going to surpass that amount this fiscal year. These numbers provide some measurement, but they do not adequately convey the quality, the nature, the effectiveness of our efforts. And for that, we have to ask questions like, did we focus on the most serious violations? Did we obtain meaningful punishments that deter unlawful conduct? Did we incapacitate wrongdoers? Did we recoup ill-gotten gains and return money to investors? I'm not going to drag you through all the cases we've brought. We provide this information in the annual report that we publish every year. But I am going to discuss a few efforts I think answer those questions and merit highlighting. So let me start with financial fraud. We put a sharp focus on financial fraud and issuer disclosure. Integrity and accuracy in financial statements and issuer disclosures are critical to the functioning of our capital markets. Over the past 3 years, the Commission has brought hundreds of enforcement actions involving virtually all aspects of the financial reporting process. These included actions charging entities and individuals with alleged fraudulent accounting practices intended to misrepresent a company's underlying financial condition, as in the Commission's actions against Theranos, Hertz, and Penn West and their former executives. Intentionally distorted non-GAAP metrics and key performance indicators, as in the Commission's actions against Wells Fargo, Fiat Chrysler, Valeant, and Walgreens. Misrepresentations or omissions in connection with risk factors, as in the Commission's actions against Facebook and Mylan. Materially misleading and incomplete disclosures that we see in the Commission's actions against Nissan and Volkswagen and their former executives. And finally, failures by auditors to uphold their duties as gatekeepers, as in the action against KPMG for improperly obtaining information about PCAOB inspections, as well as in dozens of actions brought against individuals and firms. We are not the first to focus on financial fraud matters, but I believe our efforts in this space, including some of the important changes in strategy and approach that I'll discuss later, have made foundational changes that will reap benefits in the future. A second area that merits discussion is our continued focus on misconduct by registrants that negatively impacts the integrity of our markets. These are often complex investigations that require substantial expertise, and some examples include charges the Commission brought against a number of the world's largest financial institutions, including JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, and Merrill Lynch, for engaging in improper conduct in connection with the pre-release of American depository receipts. In total, the Commission brought actions against 15 financial institutions, and ordered more than $432 million in disgorgement and penalties in connection with this conduct. Charges against broker-dealers and investment advisors involving the sale of unsuitable products, including an action against Wells Fargo for failing reasonably to supervise investment advisors and registered representatives who recommended single inverse ETF investments to retail investors. Complex market structure cases, including against Merrill Lynch for misleading customers about how it handled their orders, and cases against exchanges and similar market participants, including a case against the New York Stock Exchange and its affiliates for regulatory failures in connection with several disruptive market events, as well as a case against the Options Clearing Corp for policy and procedure failures related to financial risk management, operational requirements, and information system security. A third core area for us has been insider trading. Over the last several years, we have gotten even smarter and more sophisticated in how we analyze data to identify and pursue insider trading schemes. The examples here range from allegations involving a large international insider trading scheme involving investment bankers and traders, to then Congressman Christopher Collins tipping his son after receiving confidential information about negative clinical drug trial results, to a scheme by a hacker and multiple traders to hack into the SEC's EDGAR system. Fourth is the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, where we've continued to be very active. A few cases to note include actions against Novartis after subsidiaries engaged in schemes to make improper payments to provide benefits to healthcare providers in South Korea, Vietnam, and Greece in exchange for prescribing or using certain products. Against Ericsson for engaging in a large-scale bribery scheme involving the use of sham consultants to secretly funnel money to government officials in multiple countries, and Telia, which is a good example of international cooperation, for offering and paying at least $330 million in bribes to win business in Uzbekistan. Another traditional area of enforcement is Ponzi schemes and offering frauds. One of the greatest threats to retail investors continues to be those who outright prey on people, including sometimes their own friends, family members, and those in their communities. And even now, having been back in the Division of Enforcement for more than 6 years, I continue to be shocked by how many and how widespread these schemes are. We aggressively pursue these schemes by filing emergency actions to stop conduct, freeze assets, and appoint receivers to manage the assets, as well as by litigating in bankruptcy court and with receivers to maximize return to victims. There are unfortunately way too many of these cases to name, but the largest in recent years was an emergency action we brought against Robert Shapiro and the Woodbridge Group to halt misconduct and freeze assets in an alleged ongoing Ponzi scheme that raised more than $1.2 billion for more than 8,400 retail investors. Due in part to the Commission's intervention and successful litigation in bankruptcy court, we expect that investors will ultimately recover 50% or more of their investment. That is a very meaningful recovery in a case like this. So let me pivot now just to for a moment to an area of newer focus, which Jay mentioned briefly, initial coin offerings. At the start of our tenure, we found ourselves confronted with the sudden proliferation of these offerings. And I'm not going to repeat what Chairman Clayton already said on this issue, except to express my agreement with his characterization of the division as nimble in its response to the ICO explosion. One of the more notable cases the Commission filed was in an emergency action against Telegram, alleging that its unregistered offering of digital tokens violated the federal securities laws. After the court granted the Commission's motion for a preliminary injunction halting the offering, the Commission reached a settlement whereby Telegram agreed to return more than $1.2 billion to investors. And finally, a critical part of our program continues to be seeking to deter wrongdoing by holding individuals accountable, which we have done in roughly 70% of cases over time. We've pursued charges against individuals for misconduct across the spectrum of the securities markets, including registered individuals, executives at all levels of the corporate hierarchy, including CEOs, CFOs, and other high-ranking executives, as well as gatekeepers such as accountants, auditors, and attorneys. In many of the cases I mentioned earlier, the Commission acted against C-suite executives and gatekeepers, including in the Tesla, Theranos, Valeant, Walgreens, and Volkswagen actions, as well as in many other cases. So I'm going to shift gears a little, and next I'd like to discuss ways in which we identified and made changes within the division. Among other things, we created initiatives to protect retail investors, made changes to increase efficiency, took steps to maximize our use of resources, messaged the benefits of cooperation, and in some cases, designed tailored remedies. Our focus on financial fraud and issuer disclosure cases resulted in some significant changes in how we approach identifying and investigating potential misconduct. Our proactive efforts to identify cases has employed a variety of research approaches, internal and external tools, and other information sets. We routinely look at all public information about an issuer, statements made by a company or its officers in filings, during investor presentations, in tweets or blog posts, related commentary by others, including analysts, shorts, competitors, shareholders, to develop a deep understanding of the company's reporting environment and history and industry. And this is not a low-cost investment, but it has provided substantial value in identifying potential financial fraud. Further, in appropriate cases, we've been employing strategies to streamline our investigations in an effort to substantially accelerate the pace of the investigation. This has come through a purposeful effort by our investigative teams to efficiently triage issues, increase staffing, make more targeted requests at the outset, substantively engage early with the relevant parties, and leverage cooperation. We have already seen some success in our acceleration efforts and expect to see those successes continue in the near and long term. Another area of innovation is our initiatives to protect retail investors. Consistent with the priorities outlined by Chairman Clayton, we focused closely on ways to protect retail investors and return money to those harmed by wrongdoers. We encouraged the staff to think strategically and creatively about areas in which retail investors could be taken advantage of. Folks came up with many ideas that we explored. Some of our efforts addressed problems we knew about, and others looked for problems we didn't know about. I'll give you two examples. First is the share class selection disclosure initiative that the chairman mentioned earlier. To take on a problem we knew about and had already brought several cases addressing, we created a self-reporting initiative focused on the recurring problem of advisors failing to disclose conflicts of interest associated with the selection of fee-paying mutual fund share classes when a lower or no-cost share class of the same mutual fund was available. Under the initiative, we agreed to recommend standardized settlement terms for firms that self-reported these failures. Ultimately, this initiative resulted in the SEC ordering nearly 100 investment advisory firms that voluntarily self-reported to return nearly $140 million to investors. We also developed a number of targeted initiatives to address conduct affecting vulnerable investor groups. An example of our part of the Commission's Teachers Initiative that Chairman Clayton referred to earlier. Here, we looked for potential issues that we did not know about in the administration of teacher retirement plans. And as part of that effort, we've been examining how third-party administrators and their affiliates choose and recommend investment options. Flowing from that, the Commission recently charged VALIC Financial Advisors for failing to disclose that its parent company paid a for-profit company owned by teachers' unions to promote VALIC's products and services to those teachers. As part of resolving the matter, VALIC agreed to cap advisory fees for certain groups of teachers in the VALIC programs, which will result in significant ongoing savings for thousands of teachers. Next, what internal changes did we make to increase efficiency? Two areas of strategic focus where we've made significant improvements are in our distributions group and our whistleblower program. Distributing money to harmed investors is a core component of achieving our investor protection mission. We've spent a great deal of resources and energy on supporting and continuing to build out our distributions group, including by closely evaluating how to create and implement efficiencies in this process. We added resources, including by temporarily detailing staff from other parts of the division and moving the group into our trial unit, where it has access to the unit's resources. Investors have reaped the benefit. Over the last 3 years, we have put $3.3 billion back into the hands of harmed investors. Indeed, in the last fiscal year alone, we distributed nearly $1.2 billion. We take great pride in the work of our distributions group. We're also very proud of the improvements we've made to the whistleblower program. This program is critically important to the SEC and to the Enforcement Division. It is important to reward whistleblowers and to do it timely. Since the enactment of the program in 2011, whistleblower tips have resulted in numerous high-quality enforcement actions, and whistleblowers have been awarded roughly $520 million. Given the success of the program, we've been flooded with increasing numbers of quality tips as well as with claims for awards. And in an effort to further increase our timeliness, we've reevaluated the entire process for considering awards and then implemented changes to make the process substantially more efficient, including by leveraging other resources of the division. We've already seen a substantial increase in the rate at which whistleblower claims are evaluated and awards are issued. So far this fiscal year, the Commission has made 25 awards, totaling approximately $133 million. This represents a more than 100% increase in the number of awards issued in a single year as compared to the next highest year. Another important area of focus has been resource allocation. Steve and I started with the truism that for every matter we are working on, there is something we are not working on. So we have to select cases that are likely to have the most meaningful impact for markets and investors. We tried to bring rigor and discipline to case selection, leaving to the Commission's Office of Compliance Inspections and Examinations conduct that we felt was more appropriately handled through the exam process. This does not mean that misconduct is going unaddressed. To the contrary, OC addresses many problems through the deficiency letter and related process, which can be a more efficient use of the Commission's resources. This has enabled us, the Commission broadly, to cover more ground and more effectively address issues of investor protection and market integrity. Second, we took steps to use our resources most efficiently and effectively. One example of this is the share class initiative I discussed earlier. Share class cases had been taking us on average 22.5 months to bring, and we had dozens of investigations in the pipeline. The self-reporting approach we developed was designed to fix the problem and quickly get money back to investors. Another example was to issue public statements to the market about areas of concern to the Enforcement Division. Being transparent about our concerns can effectively impact behavior. So for example, in 2017, together with OC, we issued a public statement urging caution about the potentially unlawful promotion of ICOs by celebrities and others. Almost immediately afterward, the anecdotal evidence we saw suggested a dramatic decline in the number of celebrity endorsements of ICOs. And as recently as 6 months ago, as Chairman Clayton mentioned, in response to the market volatility in the wake of COVID-19, we issued a statement emphasizing the importance of maintaining market integrity and following corporate controls and procedures. Finally, a third thing we did to maximize resource allocation was to try to shorten the amount of time it takes to complete investigations and bring cases. Earlier, I mentioned some specific strategies that we are using in financial fraud investigations. More broadly, we've been employing strategies to assess facts and make decisions sooner and to take steps to achieve resolutions more quickly. And we have achieved tangible success. The Commission brought its action against Elon Musk just 7 weeks after the tweet that was the subject of the case. More recently, the Commission charged the co-chair of the Unsecured Creditors Committee in the Neiman Marcus bankruptcy proceedings, alleging that he abused his position on the committee to attempt to benefit a management firm that he founded. The Commission filed its action within 5 weeks of the alleged misconduct. These are extraordinary examples of where we have moved quickly, but we have also made strides shortening our other investigations, and we expect to see more improvement in this regard going forward. We've also focused on rewarding and messaging the benefits of cooperation. We recognize the value in providing greater transparency into how the Commission considers and weighs cooperation credit. Meaningful cooperation can substantially accelerate an investigation, which is in everyone's interest. We've tried to message more clearly the benefits of cooperation, and in a number of instances, the Commission has provided that information in its orders. A good illustration of this is a case the Commission brought against PPG Industries. In that settled financial fraud action, the Commission chose not to impose a civil penalty in recognition of PPG's prompt self-reporting, extensive cooperation, and implementation of remedial measures immediately upon learning of the improper conduct for which it was charged. We recognize the value in communicating such examples of meaningful cooperation, and we will continue to look for opportunities to improve our messaging in this area. So finally, I'd like to mention our effort to think creatively about appropriate remedies. An example of this is the settlement with Tesla and Elon Musk. One part of the settlement imposed a set of comprehensive undertakings that required Mr. Musk to resign as chairman, and Tesla to add 2 new independent directors to its board and adopt mandatory controls and procedures to oversee Mr. Musk's public communications about the company. These undertakings address the specific risks in this case, the potential harm to investors caused by Mr. Musk's communication practices and a lack of sufficient oversight and control of those communications. There are a number of other cases with similarly tailored remedies, including, by way of example, the Commission's cases against former Theranos CEO Elizabeth Holmes, case against the Options Clearing Corporation, and KPMG. So that gives some sense of what Steve and I set out to do. That is, investigate and recommend to the Commission impactful cases, make strategic changes to our structure and some of the ways we investigate. I am very proud of how much we accomplished, and particularly proud of those accomplishments, as I will discuss in a moment, in light of the extraordinary challenges we faced. These include 3 Supreme Court decisions, a government shutdown, and of course, a global pandemic. Each of these challenges has required us to adjust to the circumstances, to adapt quickly, to change our thinking, and to find a new path forward. In Lucia versus the SEC, the Supreme Court held that SEC administrative law judges were officers pursuant to Article 2 of the Constitution and needed to be appointed by the President or the head of department, in this case, the Commission. The court also clarified that the appropriate remedy was a new hearing before a different ALJ or the Commission itself. Accordingly, the Commission ordered that respondents in cases that were pending before an ALJ or before the Commission on appeal from an ALJ decision be provided with the opportunity for a new hearing before an ALJ who had not participated in the matter previously. I cannot stress enough the impact this had on the division. We had to make decisions about roughly 200 cases that were remanded, 200 returned cases to our investigation that our investigators and our litigators had to turn back to, and some of those cases were more than a decade old. We pulled together a team of experienced trial lawyers to evaluate, triage, and make recommendations regarding each case. Some cases needed to be retried by entirely new trial teams who were pulled from active investigations and litigations, and as you might imagine, this required significant effort and resource allocation. So I'll turn next to Kokesh. In Kokesh versus the SEC, the Supreme Court held that the 5-year statute of limitations in 28 U.S.C. Section 2462 applies to disgorgement orders sought by the Commission. By our estimate, this caused the Commission to forego approximately $1.1 billion in disgorgement in filed cases. It also required us to reevaluate how we address disgorgement in active investigations and in settlements and litigation. Again, we put together a group from Enforcement and the Office of the General Counsel to consider our overall approach to disgorgement outside the context of a specific case and reevaluate those practices in light of the Supreme Court's discussion. We made a number of changes as a result of this effort across all of the division's cases, regardless of whether they increased or decreased the amount of disgorgement. Kokesh also stated in a footnote that nothing in this opinion should be interpreted as an opinion on whether courts possess authority to order disgorgement in SEC enforcement proceedings or on whether courts have properly applied disgorgement principles in this context. In the aftermath, we faced a lot of collateral attacks on the Commission's ability to seek disgorgement following Kokesh. Ultimately, not a single court ruled against us. The approach we adopted following Kokesh anticipated many aspects of the decision the court issued 2 years later, which brings me to the next big decision. Earlier this year, the Supreme Court decided the Liu case. First, this was a great decision for us, and it underscores what we've asserted from the beginning, that disgorgement is available to the Commission in its enforcement actions. But it also imposed limitations and left open some questions. While the court held that disgorgement should reflect net profits, it also held that legitimate expenses should generally be backed out. The court also emphasized the importance of returning disgorged funds to harmed investors. Once again, we're dedicating resources to evaluating the impact of this decision and how the questions the court left open will affect us going forward. As a result, you should expect to see some changes in the balance between the penalties and disgorgement that we seek and recommend to the Commission. Penalties may be higher in some cases where the statutory scheme permits us to do so. We will make our recommendations consistent with the court's decision, but we will also seek the relief necessary to achieve our mission of protecting investors and maintaining market integrity. In other challenges in 2019, after a multi-year hiring freeze, we faced a near complete cessation of activity resulting from the 35-day lapse in appropriations. Of course, the effect of the government shutdown was not limited to those 35 days. There was a ripple effect that stalled investigations for much longer than the 5 weeks we were out of the office. But as soon as we were able, the enforcement staff made up for lost time. By the end of that fiscal year, the Commission had filed 862 enforcement actions and obtained $4.3 billion in financial remedies. Record financial remedies and a near record number of enforcement actions. In fact, the Commission was exactly 7 cases shy of filing its highest number of cases in a single year, a number previously reached in a year with a full 365 days, and when the division had roughly 150 more people. Finally, this past year, we faced the biggest and most unexpected challenge of all. Since mid-March, the entire division has been working from home. Like everyone else, we have faced serious concerns about our health and safety and that of our families, and have had to balance our work against additional responsibilities at home. I could not be more impressed with how the staff responded. We reacted promptly to the threats presented by COVID-19, as well as the ensuing dynamic market conditions. Starting in February 2020, the Commission began suspending trading in the securities of companies that claimed to have developed treatments for the coronavirus where there were questions regarding the accuracy and adequacy of information in the marketplace. So far, we've suspended trading in 36 issuers, with 24 of those in March and April alone, followed shortly thereafter by 5 COVID-19-related fraud actions. In recent months, the suspicious conduct has dropped off dramatically, which can be fairly attributed to the speed with which we acted to address this conduct and which deterred others from repeating it and harming additional investors. Further, we have been inundated with more than 13,000 tips, complaints, and referrals since mid-March. This represents a 64% increase over the same period last year. More broadly, the Coronavirus Steering Committee that we formed in March continues to coordinate scores of investigations relating to a wide variety of potential misconduct, including microcap fraud, insider trading, and financial fraud and issuer disclosure misconduct. Since mid-March, the division has opened nearly 150 COVID-related inquiries or investigations. And of course, we face significant challenges to our regular portfolio of ongoing investigations and litigations. Many investigations required more time and attention for various reasons, including difficulties stemming from limitations on in-person activity, such as slowed document productions and delays in testimony. Even so, since mid-March, the Commission has filed more than 325 new enforcement actions. But most impressive, really, is how the staff continued to protect the securities markets. From kitchens and living rooms, while at the same time being caregivers and teachers and juggling video calls with all manner of chaos in the background. These are unprecedented circumstances, and the staff acted in unprecedented ways to respond to all of the challenges we faced. I remain hopeful that all we have done during these most difficult of times will be viewed as a success, as an example of what citizens and government should do in a crisis. I could not be more proud of the women and men of the Enforcement Division. And so, back to where I started. As we wrap up this fiscal year, I can say for sure that this year will not look like last year or the year before. It just can't. We spent half the year enveloped by a pandemic, but what we accomplished was extraordinary. And from my perspective, the Enforcement Division's response to this crisis is a stark illustration of why statistics can never present a real full picture of the nature or effectiveness of an enforcement program. And so as I look back upon the last 3+ years, since I was fortunate enough to be appointed to what I often call the best job in Washington, it is clear to me that we have been and continue to be committed to a strong, aggressive enforcement program that has overcome challenges to do its part to protect investors and maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets. Steve and I were fortunate enough to begin our tenure together on the back of a historically strong enforcement program. Our predecessors left the division in a great place, and we were able to build on their success. The changes Steve and I introduced improved on a good thing, and they will leave the division stronger. But I echo what Chairman Clayton said at the outset. The strength and effectiveness of this enforcement program is a function of the people in it. and I know that they will continue to work tirelessly to protect investors and preserve the integrity of our markets. The Division of Enforcement was strong before we got here, and it will remain strong long after we've moved on. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Stephanie. My first task before I forget is the next CLE code word, which is Peikin. I know Steve likes that. And my next task is to start to funnel some questions. I've got a queue of questions. Actually, I've got several queues building up. So I'm going to be kind of looking around at multiple sources. I'm going to encourage our panelists, our former directors, to chime in as well. But I've got my first question teed up. And my question starts with where, Stephanie, you ended your remarks, that statistics don't necessarily paint the full picture of the enforcement story. And Jay said, Jay drew this distinction between harm remedied and harm prevented, which I think is very telling, right? We tend to measure the Commission's effectiveness in terms of filed cases and fees collected, but obviously the Commission's ability to deter wrongdoing is far more important in ensuring market integrity. So Joshua Harden had a related question. He asks whether if deterrence is so important, how can we measure deterrent effect over the long term?
Look, I think it's a terrific question, and it goes to the whole of the Commission. You know, deterrence is, and you have a number of former directors now who are out in private practice and are engaging with boards of directors and management teams on in the corporate side. But deterrence is about people making decisions knowing that someone is watching. That's what it is at the end of the day. And the more in that type of environment, whether it's as a result of an outside counsel, a compliance officer, some combination of that, our efforts change the behavior and change the oversight. That's the deterrence. And it's not just enforcement, which is a huge part of it, but it's also structural. For my money, adding independent directors to corporations through Sarbanes-Oxley, huge bang for the buck deterrence. Adding some of those other low-cost, high-touch structural things, deterrence. And then, look, I think you'll hear from the panelists. We believe it that when we bring actions, particularly in the corporate sphere, people take notice. Law firms write memos, boards of directors take notice, and individual accountability is extremely important. Over to you, Steph.
No, that you got it there. That's what I was going to say. I think, when you think about deterrence, individual accountability is one of the most critical things I think we can do to affect deterrence. And that is, in part why it's such an important part of our program.
It's Linda Thompson. The only thing I would add on this is that one of the underlying issues in the question is how do you measure that? And that has proven, at least to my mind, to be extraordinarily difficult. I can remember a time when Steve Cutler, frustrated at a particular office that regularly would announce that it had brought more cases than anyone else in the prior year and therefore needed more resources in the upcoming year, tried to deconstruct the numbers to evaluate the value of the case, how much of the case was a follow-on, how many resources it took to accomplish the outcome. Was it the right outcome? Was it too cheap a settlement? Was it too substantial a settlement? And that's extraordinarily difficult to do, and yet it is a sort of the essential part of what we're trying to accomplish.
And I guess
I completely agree with that, Linda. I think it is very difficult to measure, what we don't know and what it is that drives people. Ultimately, I think the most we can do is continue to bring meaningful actions with meaningful remedies and, hope that it makes a difference.
And I guess when we talk about deterrence, right, we're not just talking about what happens in enforcement. So Dan Gallagher has a question that says, can you discuss your approach to the Hertz bankruptcy stock offering issue? Dan says, it seems to me the commission acted to head off the offering through the Corp Fin process as opposed to the post facto enforcement process. And he thinks that's both noteworthy and welcomed.
Well, I rarely disagree with Dan, but and I won't do so here. But I think he's right. Look, that was a situation where our view was that the disclosure needed further work, and it was important to tell investors that the disclosure needed further work, and hopefully that did prevent unnecessary losses. And so, we stepped in and made it clear to the public that our view was further work was necessary. I'll also comment that that's a situation where there were a number of gatekeepers involved, and let me make this clear. In terms of deterrence, use the architecture we have. Our gatekeepers, underwriters, accountants, lawyers, other professionals, they have jobs to do, and we expect them to do them. They're repeat players, and when they do their jobs, it prevents a lot of wrongdoing.
Yeah, if I could weigh in on that, Jay, one of the things, Mr. Chairman, you said about deterrence, one of the things we hear a lot of criticism about is this notion of the revolving door, and it's corrupting the process. And I've always thought it was a misguided criticism of the agency and the alums. One of the things that most people have no visibility on is the defense bar and those who practice before the SEC do they defend their clients, they argue with the staff, they push them, they provide the best and most appropriate advice in trying to manage people through the enforcement process. The thing people don't see is the level of compliance in a system that depends on self-policing and self-disclosure by the alumni of the SEC is something that in substantial measure makes our markets work. It's not just alums, but those people who have been there, who understand the process, who understand the value of full disclosure, who understand what a free and fair market means, provide an enormous deterrent in the advice they give they give to their clients, because the issue of, let me tell you about what happened to so-and-so or to this company or to that company, that has an enormously effective impact on individuals. And we all have clients, some of them are wonderful people, who can talk themselves into anything and rationalize things. And I think one of the values that those who've been at the agency provide when they move on is the discipline that makes the free market system that relies on self-policing and full disclosure actually work.
Just chime in because
go ahead.
This is such an interesting.
So others chime in and then I'll comment.
Well, I don't want to interrupt you, Jay, so go ahead.
Well, that's the first time you said that. Well, look, Bill, I think you're right. Carrying that culture of compliance and commitment and understanding that the markets we have here are superior to anywhere else in the world because of that, that's an important thing to the continuation. I can also tell you that bringing in people from the outside refreshes the knowledge at the commission. Markets are ever evolving. During the recent COVID dislocations in the market, I was very grateful to have people here who had recently been in the private sector and understood trading across our cash and derivatives markets and the connections with the short-term funding markets. And we were able to take swift measures to provide relief that was, market efficiency enhancing, investor protection enhancing, and that was in large part due to a combination of longtime career staff and new people who had a sense of how the market was functioning today. So, look, continuing to refresh knowledge at the SEC, to continue to build that culture outside the SEC, those are all very important things.
Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, I think an important and overlooked, factor in deterrence is, more important than, counting up the pile of cases that were brought in some particular period, or, even maybe the amount of, of financial remedies assessed, is the speed with which actions are brought. And it's something that, Stephanie and I worked very hard to try to move. We have a metric of average time from opening of an investigation to filing of the first action, and that number is a sticky number. Even when you try to bring cases by clearing off the oldest investigations, it actually has the opposite effect on that metric. It makes it go up because you're clearing off the oldest investigations. But I think when, as I reflect back, bringing actions close in time to when the conduct occurred sends perhaps the strongest message. That the Tesla case and the Musk case, which, obviously in light of intervening events now seem kind of quaint, right? But that case got, I think, a lot of attention, not just because of the notoriety, obviously, of the respondent, but also, I think, the surprise from a lot of quarters at the speed with which, the commission was able to act. And so I just think that is something that, is an identifiable issue, trying to compress and telescope the length of investigations. And it really is an important deterrent, or creates a significant deterrent effect, because, when actions are brought, 5+ years after the relevant events, they just don't have the sting and significance of message that they do in the opposite situations.
If I could just jump in here, it's Steve Cutler. I completely agree with you, Steve Peikin, that you really achieve maximal deterrence by proximity of the case to the conduct. But we all know, and I'll address this to Stephanie, that there's a tension between sort of speed and providing process. And one of the great hallmarks of the SEC's enforcement program over the last 40, 50 years is providing process, Wells notices to potential respondents, meetings with yourselves when it's warranted. And so how do you go about, Stephanie, that balance between speed and making sure that potential respondents feel like they've gotten their day in court, because a lot of respondents don't have the opportunity to actually get to court?
Yeah, you're right. There is a tension there. And I will say, Steve and I placed a really great premium on that process. I can't think of a meeting we turned down. Anybody who asked for one essentially got one, because we think that what you just said is so important. But you're right, it's about balancing it, but it's also about, Steve and I spent a lot of time working on how to telescope the end game process, right? Because the end game can often swallow the investigation in terms of timing, the negotiations, and the back and forth. And so it is a balance, but I think we've worked pretty hard to try to, set deadlines as part of that process and hold people to them, but at the same time, take in the arguments and look, sometimes there are a series of meetings at the very end, particularly in the trickier cases where people come in and present evidence that makes you sit back and say, that is a good argument. I hadn't thought about the evidence in quite that way, and kind of go back and think, okay, is this the case we thought it was? So, and there's no doubt that process affects outcome. Absolutely no doubt. We've seen it affect outcome in all sorts of ways. So you're right. It's really about balancing it. But I do think even in those cases where we move super fast, there's space for process. But it's a matter of, of figuring out how to balance it all.
So Jay and Stephanie, I know your time is limited, so maybe one more question. We've got a series of questions from people about the media reports about corporate executives and trading behavior, and is the commission too lax on insider trading, and what's the prospect of criminal referrals? And I know you can't comment on pending cases or pending investigations, but maybe you could give us just a broad sense of how the commission's looking at these issues.
Sure. I mean, we refer lots of cases to criminal authorities. They refer lots of cases to us. We have probably at any given time hundreds of cases, that we're coordinating on. So it's a pretty substantial part of the docket. Last year, towards the end of last year, we actually hosted a conference here at the SEC, Steve and I did, where we invited United States attorneys, folks in U.S. attorneys' offices, FBI, other partners that we work with, other agencies, and they all came here for the day to really have a full day meeting on cooperation and how can we continue to supplement each other, how can we be a force multiplier for each other. So I think there's, I obviously can't comment on specific cases or anything like that, but we have a very strong working relationship, and I think there are a number of cases that appropriately receive attention from both of us.
And I'll just add that the work of the market abuse unit, and there are different types of insider trading. There's the insider trading of tippers, tippies, and the like, and then you're talking about insider trading that may be engaged in by corporate executives or directors who have access directly. Our market abuse unit is extremely experienced and good at using data to, what I would say is, make that investigatory process fairly efficient. Going back to what Steve was mentioning, bringing these cases fairly efficient. You mentioned one high-profile insider trading case that I think from the time it came to us until the time it was adjudicated together with the criminal authorities was a very short amount of time.
Just to go back to this question of statistics, I think it's sort of frankly silly to judge the vigor or effectiveness of the commission's commitment to policing insider trading by looking at the pile of cases that were filed in a particular period, overlooking the fact that some of those cases could have involved years of investigation to unravel incredibly large and complex trading rings, and then saying, well, you only brought one case instead of five $30,000 golf game tipping cases. One is it's just wrong to look at that and say the five $30,000 golf game cases is much more impactful than breaking the international ring that hacked into the Edgar system. I mean, those are just apples and oranges, right?
And you've hit on something, though, Steve, that's been dogging anybody who's ever been the enforcement director. I hated Septembers because everyone was focused on the number. And I knew we were going to be lauded or criticized depending upon where it was. And at the end of the day, it is what it is. And the quality, breadth, and impact, numbers tell you something. They don't tell you. They don't give you the measure of the program, and it's just something you live with. And I had more of a battle, I think, with folks in the press who would call and say, what are you doing down there? And, there's nothing you do but ignore it in a sense because it really doesn't measure whether the program is effective or not effective.
All right. So you guys have touched a nerve, and I'm going to jump in here and I'm going to go back to the analogy that I started with, which is a well-functioning, fairly complex subsidiary. Anybody who would measure the performance of a company on one metric isn't going to be running that company very long. And anybody who would analyze a trend on one metric, whether it's increased revenue or margin compression or whatever, wouldn't be selling investment advice very long. So I kind of always crack up when I see that in this area where we drive disclosure, investor protection through robust disclosure and analysis, that you have people that do that. But I take some amusement as well as some frustration.
This is Cutler again. It's always been curious to me that when you think about how U.S. attorneys' offices and district attorneys' offices are judged from year to year, you almost never read about statistics. And I don't know why it is that we've all fallen into the trap, including a lot of people on this panel, of measuring our success somehow through numerical metrics, and they just don't do it justice. And part of it is what Jay said. I think, relying on a single metric, the number of cases, is particularly not well suited to measuring the division. But you could take probably 10 metrics and they don't necessarily tell the story. And why it is that law enforcement at the SEC gets judged that way and other law enforcement doesn't is beyond me.
Absolutely fair. So Jay's staff is going to have my neck, because I've kept Jay and Stephanie well over the time that they allotted for this Q&A, but it's been fascinating, and I'm really grateful to the two of you for hanging around and participating in this discussion. It's now my task to move us to the second part of the program, which is a panel discussion among our former directors of enforcement. Before I do that, I think I need to give you guys another code word, another CLE code word, and that word is Thomsen. And with that, let me very briefly, because it's much more interesting to listen to the former directors than to me, let me briefly introduce and welcome our panel. And this is in alphabetical as opposed to chronological order. You've already heard from them, but Steve Cutler is currently the global head of Simpson, Thacher, and Bartlett's government and internal investigations practice. He was, prior to that, vice chairman of JP Morgan Chase and general counsel. He was the director of enforcement at the SEC from October 2001 to 2005, and he was also a law school classmate of mine. Just thought I'd note that potential conflict of interest. Bill McLucas is chair of the Securities Department at WilmerHale. He joined the firm after serving as the director of enforcement for 8 years, 1989 to 1998, which is longer than any other enforcement division director in commission history. Steve Peikin, as you can tell from the discussion, was named co-director of the Division of Enforcement in June 2017 and held that position until just last month. Before that, he was managing partner at Sullivan & Cromwell's Criminal Defense and Investigations Group. And before that, he was an assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York and chief of the office's Securities and Commodities Task Force. And finally, Linda Chatham Thomsen is counsel in Davis Polk's litigation department and practices in Washington, D.C. She was the first woman to serve as the director of the Division of Enforcement, and she held that position from 2005 to February of 2009. Welcome, former directors, and I think we're going to kick off with an opportunity for each of you to, set the stage, pose a question, give us your reaction to Jay's remarks or anything else. And you haven't been shy thus far. Feel free to chime in so we can have a discussion. Should I name a starting person? I'll do it in alphabetical order. Steve, you're up.
Okay, well, I guess one thought I would focus on is what Stephanie said toward the end of her remarks, which is that for every matter the division is working on, it's not working on another. And maybe I'll sort of point my sights back at Steve Peikin. When the chairman says and the division says we're going to focus on the retail investor, something invariably suffers. You can't do everything. And so although Stephanie's laundry list of accomplishments would suggest otherwise, I guess I would ask you, now that you can be a little bit more candid with what you guys did, what did suffer? Something had to give, and whether it was financial reporting or insider trading, something didn't get the same amount of attention, the same level of resource, because the resources are scarce. And you guys did an incredible job with a couple hundred fewer people than your predecessors had. So what, when you look back, what is it that you think, didn't get the attention that it might have because you were focused on the retail investor?
So I'd love to say nothing, but that wouldn't be, probably 100% accurate. Look, I think, we recognize that we had, fewer resources and declining resources because for 2.5 years we had a hiring freeze, and so we couldn't replace people even, who were leaving. So our numbers were steadily declining. I think that in my view, the place where we, didn't focus was on what I would kind of refer to as regulatory cases. Cases against registrants, based, in large part probably on referrals from examinations where, deficiency process or letter had been written. Maybe the money no money had been lost, or a small amount, and it had been repaid. I think in, sort of fatter times, more of those would have, resulted in enforcement investigations and perhaps cases. I think we were much more discriminating in looking at those kind of policy and procedure cases, and the like. The thing I think the narrative that I think people want to write is when you look at, when I say people, I mean, critics want to write is they say, well, you're looking at retail and there's a dichotomy between focusing on retail investor protection and policing, sort of the largest, financial institutions and intermediaries. Actually, I think it's a false, premise, because if you look at the retail investor focus, and, Stephanie talked about the share class selection disclosure initiative, that's, one great example where it's retail investor protection viewed through the lens of larger financial institutions and intermediaries. So, it's not, we're only in the Ponzi scheme and, $2 million offering fraud business. So that's kind of always my perspective on it.
Okay, so then
I think you're always faced with this issue of you're borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. But if you look at everybody who's been the chair and every enforcement director has faced a different challenge with the evolving markets. If you look at what's happened in the last 30 years with the movement of retail, the escalation of retail investors in the late 80s and the 90s, the technology impact on the market, and the lag in commission resources and the effort to catch up. I mean, Jay alluded to it with the ability to bring in some folks who really were quite sophisticated in the way markets are operating today and in the way some corners of the market, which you just don't have visibility into if you're someone who's been in the government for more than 5 years. And I think the biggest challenge that we've all faced is how quickly can you keep pace with where the market developments are, where the technology is taking things, where you need to have a presence as soon as you possibly can, because if you don't, you're going to find yourself further and further behind on the enforcement and deterrence metric. And that's something I think we've all had to struggle with. And inevitably, you have the question of, well, where do I get the resources or the people to address the new problem? And you always face, both within the building and outside, people saying, well, you're not doing enough of this. And I think that's just one of the balancing acts that everybody has tried to manage. And frankly, I think the agency has done an extraordinarily good job on keeping pace with market developments and bringing in people who are knowledgeable and expert. That was always, I thought, the biggest gap we had while I was there. As the markets changed, the use of derivatives escalated in the 90s. We were behind. And it was just tough to catch up because you needed the expertise, the people, and the resources, and the hiring and the ability to bring them in has always been quite a challenge for the division.
You know, I'm sorry, Steve. No, I was just saying, as I listened to Stephanie, one of the things that struck me, and it follows up on what Bill said, is that crisis and complexity are not new. That's sort of the history of the division. It manifests itself in different ways, but when we talk about self-reporting, each of us has probably had a program that involves self-reporting and whatnot. But to my money, the granddaddy of them all was the first when Stanley Sporkin did FCPA self-report, and largely because it wasn't illegal at the time, and it spawned a whole new statute. And so, the notion that you have to deal with crisis and complexity is something we've all dealt with all along. And I think of Steve's first year as director, and Steve, you probably had very few gray hairs as we started in the fall of 2001. But, on September 11th, 2001, at the end of the day, our New York office was a pile of rubble. The people who worked there were traumatized in a way that no one should ever be traumatized. And many of our cases had disappeared. I mean, our documents, our cases and whatnot were gone. A month later, as Bill well knows, Enron announced it was having a little problem with its third quarter and was out of business by the end of the year. By March, Adelphia had its issues, and Anderson was indicted, and the Big Five had gone to the Final Four, and it was convicted in June. A conviction of the Supreme Court ultimately said was not of a crime that was not illegal, and WorldCom had announced that it had problems as well. And then in July, Sarbanes-Oxley was enacted with a pile of regulatory requirements on the commission and rulemaking requirements. And then the year, by August, the SEC was bringing its first Enron cases, and by election day, the then chairman resigned on election eve. It was, and that doesn't even capture everything that happened that year. Now, not every year was like that. Bill probably had several that were, but it is something the commission has always dealt with. It's always understaffed. It's always got far too much to do. And it's always, as Steve said, for reasons that I don't fully understand, subject to all kinds of criticism in the way others are not.
Yeah, but when
I was just going to
it's actually fascinating. I'm sitting here listening to it and thinking about what an extraordinary window everybody who's had the good fortune to sit in that chair, both while they're there and thereafter, has had on some of the most astonishing developments in our markets in the last 30 years. But those were pretty heady days. And I remember them obviously from the other side of the table. I remember being yelled at over the inability at Enron for them to deliver answers to, I think, 18 questions for a 21A report in 48 hours. But anyway, you're right. We've all had our same. I recall also your subsequent chair, Cox, lambasting the commission after we brought the Orange County case because we weren't there to prevent the fraud 5 years earlier, which, the agency would have been roundly criticized for. But to your point, I do think we've all been there in different sort of contexts, seen a different variety of crises. Steve, you've seen them also from the Southern District's perspective. They relate to the markets and the one thing that is fascinating is that having been through it and come out in one piece, it is just an extraordinary experience to be in that chair and to have the opportunity to have a role, hopefully positive, in how the agency deals with all these things. So,
yeah, it's just the job of enforcement director and the commission, writ large, is just so much different than, a prosecutor's office. Nobody ever turned to the Southern District during the WorldCom Adelphia cases and says, "Why were you guys asleep? How did you let that happen?" Instead, I think prosecutors are treated like, heroes, and the commission comes in for, kind of a scolding when, misconduct is revealed. The thing I think, the last 3 years, frankly, from a markets perspective, put aside the month of March to 2020, were not that exciting as compared to what you guys have been talking about. The 3 years I spent in the seat were I think the 9th, 10th, and 11th years of a complete bull market with, high asset values and, pretty modest volatility. And you worry about what is it that's going on that, you're not seeing revealed by, a sort of shock, a market shock or financial crisis. And, I think, it's incumbent to sort of think about how larger structural changes in the market, what kind of misconduct can be, can be going on as a result of those kind of macro trends. I mean, we've moved much more from a brokerage model to an advisor's model, much more, for retail investors to be, invested through funds and ETFs as opposed to individual securities. Now you're seeing sort of with the development of commission-free trading, you're seeing, the sweep back in the direction of brokerage. And, you've got, I got teenage nephews who have Robinhood accounts, and, what can be going on there, right? So, I think all of that is just interesting as to what sort of these structural changes will, what kind of misconduct could, be arising and, hasn't yet been revealed.
Steve, I think your point about your nephews and their trading actually is something I've been thinking about in the last couple of months as we've been reading about the number of retail investors that are trading options and are driving markets actually with their trading in options and risky trading generally. And if you could put yourself back in the seat, I guess the question I'd ask is, what do you do about that now? How do you try to get in front of that? Because clearly it's one of these issues that when the tide recedes, you are going to see a lot of naked bodies. Going back to the discussion we had earlier about deterrence, one of the things about the SEC versus, a police department is you can't tell whether crime is actually happening or not. And the time that you tell is when actually markets get hit really, really bad. But right now we simply can't tell. And it's like we don't have a murder rate to look at. And so the question is how do you address stuff like that before it gets out of control? Because boy, by all accounts, you've got the kind of trading here that's just a recipe for disaster on the part of retail investors.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question, which is why I quit. So I wouldn't get blamed. But no, I think it's look. We did a lot of things to try to figure that out, including using engagement with large firms to try to understand what they were seeing. Using the eyes and ears of trading in markets and OC, et cetera. But, if history is a guide, there's stuff that's happening that, nobody knows is happening, and it will be revealed. I think, I thought that the incredible market volatility of earlier this year was going to, produce another sort of example of what we saw in 2008, 2009, when, the tide went out and, you could see what was going on. But the recovery, the market recovery was so dramatic and so quick that I don't think that's gonna reveal itself. So I'm not exactly sure, but I think that it's something that everybody who sat in this seat, thought a lot about, and and those will in the future will continue to also think about how do I see around the corner, right?
So, Steve,
It's going to reveal itself, yes.
the two things I worried about, one is what we just talked about. What are we not seeing on top of? What's going to happen tomorrow? What are we not sufficiently aware of that's going to blow up on us? The other thing I worried about was you have this massive staff. They're all over the country. They are smart. They're dedicated. They work hard, but people do dumb things. And some people do worse than dumb things. And one of the things that I struggled with is how do I have an environment where, in the main, people who are really smart and dedicated and work hard don't behave unprofessionally, whether it's in a regular exchange with counsel or whether it's in managing a schedule for testimony. And for the most part, the SEC does pretty well and has always done pretty well. But it is the one thing that concerned me always. That is, how do I keep the right culture, the right discipline, the right sense of ethics, recognizing that the opinion that a lot of America, a lot of executives, lawyers have about the agency is very frequently set by the interactions they have with sometimes the lowest level staff lawyer on a given case. And that's something that I know we had branch chiefs at the time. When Rob Kazami came in, they flattened the division, eliminated the branch chiefs. And the reorganization had some extraordinarily good aspects to it. It always worried me, though, on quality control and behavior. How do you ensure professionalism to the degree that you really want it to exist? And I still think the agency does an extraordinarily good job. There are instances where the interaction you'll have with some of the staff leaves you shaking your head. And I don't know whether you, Steve or Linda, you guys have thoughts about how you managed it when you were there, but it is the one thing that I always worried about because it really has had an impact on the agency's effectiveness or reputation as much as some of the cases that were or weren't brought.
Yeah, jumping in, I worried about getting rid of branch chiefs, in part because, they did have some experience. And right now you do see from time to time matters, instead of a branch chief working with a brand new staff attorney, you have a more senior staff attorney working with them. Now, some of those more senior staff attorneys are just the best on the planet. And have wisely concluded that they don't want to get anywhere near management, but some are terrible. Not many, but some, and they're the ones responsible for training, if you will, somebody new. And it does worry me. I mean, it also goes to the question that Steve and Stephanie and all of us were talking about. Resources are scarce, and as we all know, cases sort of bubble up from the ground. And people fall in love with their cases. And, I don't have much fear that at the end of the day, a case will be resolved appropriately. I do think there are cases that should have been thrown back months and sometimes years before they were, or before they're resolved with some kind of a cheap settlement, because they don't get managed at the front end. And I think that's a problem from resources. It's a problem from perception. And it doesn't take very many of them when you're on the defense side to make it much harder to persuade your clients to do that which they ought to do when they are faced with what appears to be either unreasonable behavior or unreasonable decisions. And I know, Steve, you and Stephanie, all of us struggled with trying to get to matters early to figure out what was a keeper and what wasn't, but it still strikes me as that's a problem.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's no question that in a docket of 1,500 or 2,000 investigations, there are some that are being conducted beyond, their sell-by date. That's just, that's just a management impossibility for, someone at, the director level to control. And I'd like to think that there, aren't examples of, a behavior that, irritates people on the other side. There's no question. I'm sure there is. And, you'd be surprised at some of the behaviors from the defense bar. I mean, I think you would really, really be surprised at some of the.
No, we wouldn't.
Yeah.
No, we all experienced it.
Yeah. But look, if you think about it, the division is a large organization, right? I think there's, over 1,500 lawyers, accountants, and staff, 14 or 1,500 if you include contractors. The division structure, and this is something that I thought about, but never really came up with a great idea. The director has 26 direct reports, and if McKinsey came in, I don't think they would say that's the best design, right? To have 26 people reporting directly to you. Stephanie and I met, all the time with some of those people, and weekly with some of them, and quarterly with some of them, to do case reviews and stuff like that. But that's too many people. But I don't think the solution is to have another level of supervision. The first line supervisor is the assistant director. The average assistant director, I think, has 6 people reporting to them. And a person should be able to, an effective manager should be able to supervise 6 people in their docket of cases. They may not be able to sit in all of the testimony, et cetera, but that doesn't seem like structurally that's not an appropriate organization.
Well, that's the equivalent of the way the old branch system used to work, if that's the way it works. The branches were usually about 6 people. So that actually functionally is likely the equivalent. The other thing that I think we all make a practice of, raising your hand every time you get annoyed or unhappy or the lawyer on the other side is not an effective strategy. And one of the things that most of the good defense lawyers do, I hope, is they manage through it and they deal with the staff and they deal with the chain of command. You don't call the front office, so to speak, every time you're unhappy. And people do that. I think it is a disservice to the clients, but I assume you see all manner of that or have seen it as the director.
We wouldn't entertain those kinds of calls. Those are just not, those are not the kinds of things that deserve, attention from, the director. And there are, people out there, try to take advantage of their access to, Stephanie or me when I was there. Look, I think, the agency is a highly professional agency. The tone at the top from the chairman, through the senior staff, I think is very, very good and very professional. Look, the Marine Corps court-martials Marines every year for doing terrible things. That doesn't make the Marine Corps a bad organization or its leadership ineffective. But I generally think that, the instances of sort of, bad behavior, at the line level, I think are maybe I'm being naive, but I think are few and far between. Not non-existent, but not as common as some might suggest.
Well, Steve, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. You can respond to that, but then I'm going to interrupt after that. Go ahead.
I think there are 2 kinds of issues. One is staff misconduct, if you will, and I agree, that's very, very rare. On the other hand, I can remember being extraordinarily frustrated on finding out about some really terrible behavior, to my mind, very late. And because people didn't want to raise it, for all the reasons that Bill has articulated. But the other is a broader issue of managing cases. I think, you and Stephanie see hundreds and hundreds of matters. At a staff level, people have one or two or three, and they love them, and they work hard at them. And some of those matters need to be trimmed earlier. And what happens, at least it happened to me, and I know I speak only for myself, cases would go on for a long time, and then you'd get to the point where people had invested a lot of time. And, the Division of Enforcement is in the business of bringing cases, not bringing cases, although, and that gets difficult. I know Steve did a very good job of doing directors awards. I don't know if they're still done, but one of the goals was to try to reward people who had made a decision to shut something down, because it's so difficult from a personal perspective. And that's the harder thing to manage, especially when it's sort of a bottoms-up process.
And that's, Linda, you took us back to where I wanted to go. Before I ask my question, I do need to give the fourth code word, and the fourth code word is McLucas. I know you're all surprised at that. But you talked earlier, Linda, about the message that a case sends when it's resolved with a sort of, not a very significant penalty. And we were talking earlier about deterrence and sort of managing the caseload with respect to deterrence. And I think it's exactly right. The idea that there needs to be some selection going on in where the staff's very limited resources are directed, so that you get effective deterrence. You don't have serious cases that sort of suffer for a lack of resources, and you don't have staff investing time and then feeling like they've got sunk costs in cases that really shouldn't go anywhere. So I wonder, particularly as directors of enforcement, and now you're seeing this kind of from the other side, how you think about that question.
Well, I thought it was one of the hardest issues, was trying to to figure out how to shut something down at an appropriate time, and how to make sure that whatever resolution you got was the appropriate resolution for the underlying facts. Now, on that point, the commission historically was, my background was a litigator, and to me it was quite frustrating. The commission was reluctant to factor in litigation risk. So if you had a case where you had a 60% chance of winning, I don't know how to calculate this, but versus 100%, they would want the same sort of resolution in terms of sanction in both cases. And as the litigator sitting around, I said, that struck me as not always sensible. But from a program perspective, it is. If it's a case that you should be bringing, you should get the appropriate sanction for it. But it's one of the hardest calls we had to make.
I guess I'd also say every organization goes through this at some level. I used to think when I was at JP Morgan that one of the jobs of the company's CEO, who saw 1,000 different potential transactions, deals, business opportunities, etc., was none of them was so important to him that he couldn't say no. And, Linda made the point earlier, every staff attorney falls in love with his or her case. That, the more senior you get within the organization, the more your job is to say, in the scheme of things, this doesn't work. That's the job. I can think of very few times where I had to say to somebody, bring a better case than the one you're bringing. Bring a stronger case than the one that you propose. I'd say 95 times out of 100, my job was to say, it's not that good. And that's not just true of the SEC. It's true of organizations, throughout the world, in industry and different government institutions, et cetera. That's just the way it is.
I mean, the balance, when the chairman began this program, I was looking at his remarks when he talked about what do you do to have the kind of enforcement program you want. He said, we need an environment where the professionals have a combination of guidance, freedom, and support that enables them to take action and maximize their effectiveness. I can't tell you how many times years ago a case would come in from an office, sometimes a regional office, and I would look at it and say, well, this is not a case, or, the risk here is about 75-30 we lose. And then the conversation would be, well, I think he's going to settle. And I'd say, I can't, look, that doesn't get me there. And one of the appeals that the regional office heads would have to me is, if you don't authorize this case, it's going to hurt morale. And that was the worst thing to argue, because but I think the challenge, and you do it with good leadership, though. People will, when you make the call, they trust you. They know you're not there to throw cases out, you're there to get the right result. And that is unfortunately part of the job. Sometimes things make their way up the chain of command. People are in love with them. And your answer is, I'm sorry, we are not going to take this to the table. I've looked at the evidence. I've looked at the law. We don't have a case, or we don't have a case that's worthy. Now let's go do something that makes sense. And every director has made those decisions, and I think there's been an effort to push that thinking down through the ranks. I will tell you, the further you get removed from the leadership of the division, the harder it is sometimes to persuade the staff. As Steve said, people fall in love with their cases, and that's just an attribute of being in the job that are in the institution that you live with.
So we're getting to the end of our time slot. I have one last question, and it's a little bit of an unfair question, but we're living in an environment in which, to my view, we can't possibly predict anything, including, whether we're going to get up in the morning tomorrow. But I want to push you guys, because you're not at the commission right now. If you had to guess, if you had a crystal ball, if you wanted to predict the biggest enforcement challenge that the commission is going to have to deal with over the next several months, what would it be?
I don't have any trouble answering that question. I think that far and away, the Enforcement Division's activity level, over the last few months has remained, good, because in large measure, I believe it reflects sort of the completion of matters that had largely been fully investigated by the time the pandemic hit. And, you can resolve a case remotely. It's much, much harder to build a case through investigation remotely, where you can't travel. Your ability to compel people to show up for investigative testimony is challenged or limited. And I think maintaining a high level of activity and being able to build cases over the next few months is going to be a challenge. And I think it's not clear how it's going to play out entirely. I think that testimony can be taken remotely in a very effective way. It's not as great as sitting across the table, but it requires some degree of cooperation by all sides to do it correctly.
I think looking at more than a few months, there's market uncertainty. There's going to be budget pressure that's going to be extraordinary given where the budget is in the spending right now. There will be a challenge in having reasoned discrimination in budget decisions on the Hill and in the next administration, whichever that is, to recognize whatever you do, you are going to need a viable and effective and reasonably well-funded agency to oversee the markets. And I think the third thing I would point to as a a challenge for the institution will be the polarization and politicization of everything in Washington has not let or passed by the agency. I think the agency has remained independent and done its job. This chairman has been a breath of fresh air in every way you can imagine, because he has really run a extraordinarily effective program, and you would be hard pressed to find anybody in Washington to criticize him. And that in and of itself says something. And it's not because he's a political animal, it's because he's done a good job. I do worry that going forward, it's going to be hard for the institution to stay out of the fray, because everyone is a target and everything becomes a political issue. And this agency has done a remarkable job now for 80 plus years of staying above it all, and I just hope that it can going forward.
I think, as I think of substance, I think about all of the institutions and entities that find themselves before the commission in a variety of ways, and all of those institutions are being challenged from a cultural perspective. I mean, the bulk of the potential respondents and defendants that come before the SEC are law-abiding, legitimate businesses, but their cultures are being tremendously challenged as everyone is so fractured, and the pressure to make money is always there. It's going to get worse, and with everyone being remote, there are going to be challenges from data security to passing on culture to making decisions that are supervised. So I think we're going to see there'll be an uptick in activity, in part because people are so fragmented.
Steve Cutler, you get the last word on this.
I don't know if I have a lot to add. I do think the combination of what Steve Peikin mentioned, which is sort of the pig and the python in the SEC's investigative processes, combined with, I think, sort of an environment where, we're likely to see a lot more bad activity or bad activity being uncovered. I think the combination of those two things is going to create quite a challenge. And then I'll just leave it on the issue that Bill raised. I do think that the agency has, over the last 25, 30, 40 years, really become much more politicized. I think, if you wind the clock back to Bill's time, I don't think you saw the commission fractured on party lines. And you really see a lot more of that today. I think Jay has done an incredible job, as Bill alluded to, tamping that down. But it's right below the surface, it seems to me, and I worry that in the next administration, whatever it is, the next chairmanship, that the politics may not be as tamped down, and I don't think that serves the agency well.
Great comments from all of you. Thank you. Well, that brings us to 6:29. And if you know ILE, you know we always end our programs on time. Unfortunately, I can't figure out how to clap hands using WebEx, but all of the virtual participants, I can assure you, are thanking you for a terrific program. ILE and Penn Law, thank you as well. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.